I never expected that a university biology lab, a place of sterile surfaces and predictable outcomes, would become the epicenter of the most chaotic and unpredictable event of my life. For 2 semesters, that lab had been my sanctuary. It was a world governed by rules, by titrations and cellular mitosis, by things that could be measured, recorded, and understood. My life outside of it was much the same. A tidy, single-bedroom apartment, a rigid study schedule, and a carefully curated solitude that kept the world at a manageable distance. I had built walls not of brick, but of routine, and they had served me well. Then Julian was assigned as my lab partner. He was the variable I could never account for. Where I was quiet and methodical, Julian was a low, steady hum of energy. He moved through the world with an effortless grace that I could only observe from behind the safety of my own awkwardness. He was tall, with shoulders that seemed too broad for his lab coat, and dark, unruly hair that he was constantly pushing back from his forehead with a steady hand. He was, in the most objective and scientific sense, a perfect specimen, and I, the scientist, was completely undone by him. Our partnership was a study in contrasts. My lab notes were a testament to precision, filled with neat, cramped handwriting and perfectly rendered diagrams. His were a chaotic sprawl of observations, questions, and arrows pointing to half-finished thoughts, yet he always seemed to grasp the core concepts with an intuition that baffled me. He would lean over my shoulder to look at a slide through my microscope, and the clean, subtle scent of his soap would eclipse the sterile, antiseptic smell of the lab. It was a scent that clung to my senses long after he'd pulled away, a ghost of warmth in my cold, ordered world. The barrier between us felt as solid and impermeable as the glass of the beakers we used. He was like a sculpture in a museum, something to be admired for its form and beauty, but never, ever touched. He was popular, surrounded by a rotating cast of friends who laughed easily at his quiet jokes. He spoke of weekend plans that involved hiking or going to concerts, activities that felt as foreign to me as deep-sea exploration. I was convinced he was straight, that he moved through a world of pretty girls and casual dating that I had no access to. My admiration for him was a secret I kept locked away, a specimen preserved in the formaldehyde of my own certainty. It was safer that way. To want something you could never have was a special kind of foolishness, and I was not a fool. So I observed. I cataloged the minutiae of his existence the way I did the stages of cell division. I learned the exact timbre of his voice when he was concentrating, a low rumble that vibrated through the lab bench we shared. I learned that he had a small, almost invisible scar just above his left eyebrow, visible only when the harsh fluorescent lights hit it at a certain angle. I learned that he chewed on the end of his pen when he was thinking, a habit that I found inexplicably endearing. These small, insignificant details became the focus of my world, a private collection of moments that I would take out and examine in the quiet of my apartment. It was a pathetic sort of intimacy, the only kind I felt I was allowed. He was kind, always. He never commented on my silence, instead filling it with his own calm observations about our work. "Looks like we have contamination in sample B," he'd murmur, his voice a gentle counterpoint to the frantic thumping of my own heart. He would pass me a slide or a pipette, and for a terrifying, exhilarating split second, our fingers would brush. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure energy that would short-circuit my carefully constructed composure. I would pull my hand back as if burned, my face flushing, and hope he hadn't noticed. He never gave any indication that he did. He was simply existing, and I was orbiting him like a lost, lonely moon, drawn in by a gravity I couldn't resist but dared not succumb to. This was my status quo, a quiet, aching admiration from a safe and sterile distance. I had accepted it. I had made peace with the fact that Julian would only ever be my lab partner, a temporary feature in my life who would one day disappear, leaving behind nothing but the faint, lingering scent of his soap and the ghost of his warmth. I told myself it was enough. It was not enough. The disruption came, as they so often do, disguised as a mundane necessity. Our final project for Professor Albright's class was a monstrous undertaking, a multi-week experiment on bacterial resistance that required constant monitoring. It meant late nights, hours spent in the hushed, empty silence of the biology building after everyone else had gone home. For most people, it was a chore. For me, it was a terrifying gift. More time alone with Julian. More opportunities for my carefully controlled facade to crack. The forecast had been calling for a storm all week, a late spring monster brewing over the plains. The sky had been a bruised, heavy purple all day, the air thick with a tension that mirrored my own. We were the only two left in the lab that evening, surrounded by the quiet hum of refrigerators and the rhythmic slosh of the orbital shaker. The world outside the large plate glass windows was darkening prematurely, the streetlights casting a sickly orange glow against the bruised clouds. "Looks like it's going to be a bad one," Julian said, his voice startling me out of my trance. He was leaning against the lab bench, his arms crossed over his chest. The pose stretched the fabric of his t-shirt across his shoulders, and I had to force myself to look away, focusing instead on the petri dish in my hands. "Yeah," I managed, my voice sounding thin and reedy to my own ears. The news said high winds. Possible hail. My contribution to the conversation was a weather report. Pathetic. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the window. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, splattering against the glass like thrown pebbles. Then came the wind, a low moan that rattled the window frames. Within minutes, the gentle rain had become a torrential downpour, a solid sheet of water that blurred the world outside into an abstract mess of light and shadow. The sound was deafening, a constant, roaring static that filled the lab and drowned out the hum of the equipment. And then, the lights flickered. Once, twice. They went out. The darkness was absolute, a sudden, suffocating blanket. The roaring rain was the only sound. My heart leaped into my throat, a panicked bird trapped in the cage of my ribs. A second later, the emergency lights kicked in with a dull clunk. They were weak, casting a pale, ghostly green glow that turned the familiar lab into a strange, alien landscape. The essential equipment, the incubators, the freezers, hummed back to life, powered by the building's backup generator. But the main room was plunged into a dim, eerie twilight. We were trapped. The automated doors to the building locked after 10 p.m. The storm had knocked out the main power, and we were sealed inside this bubble of dim light and roaring sound, alone. The carefully defined space of our lab partnership had just been shattered. The sterile, predictable environment was gone, replaced by an intimacy so sudden and profound it stole my breath. The silence between us stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the storm's fury. In the strange green light, Julian's face was all sharp angles and deep shadows. He looked less like a museum sculpture now and more like something ancient and elemental, a part of the storm itself. I could feel the heat radiating from him across the small distance that separated us, a tangible presence in the now chilling room. "Well," he said, and his voice was startlingly close. He had moved without my noticing. "I guess we're not going anywhere for a while." I could only nod, my throat too tight to form words. My entire world had been reduced to this single room, to the sound of the rain, and to the overwhelming presence of the man standing a few feet away from me. The walls of my routine had been breached, and I was adrift in a chaotic, terrifying new territory. The experiment was no longer the one on the lab bench. It was me. The new boundaries, or lack thereof, were a minefield. The familiar script of our interactions, discussing data, cleaning glassware, the polite but distant dance of lab partners, was useless now. We were just two people in a dark room, waiting out a storm. The professional context had been washed away by the rain, leaving something raw and uncertain in its place. "You're shivering," Julian observed. His voice was soft, a low counterpoint to the storm's roar. I hadn't even realized it, but he was right. The building's heating had gone out with the power, and a damp chill was seeping into the lab. My thin hoodie was no match for it. Before I could protest or insist I was fine, he was shrugging off his own jacket. It was a simple, dark gray fleece, but on him, it had seemed like a piece of armor. He held it out to me. "Here." "Oh no, I couldn't," I stammered, my hands instinctively pulling back. "You'll be cold." He gave a small, wry smile that was barely visible in the gloom. "I'll be fine. I run warm." It was such a simple, factual statement, but it landed in my chest like a physical blow. I knew he ran warm. I had felt the heat coming off him in waves for months. He didn't wait for my acceptance. He stepped closer, the space between us shrinking to almost nothing, and draped the jacket over my shoulders. His fingers brushed the side of my neck as he did, a fleeting, feather-light touch of warm skin against my own cold flesh. It was an explosion in miniature. Every nerve ending in my body screamed to life. The fabric of the jacket was still warm from his body, and it smelled of him, that clean, soap-and-something-else scent, now mixed with the faint, ozonic smell of the rain. I pulled it tighter around myself, a gesture that was equal parts seeking warmth and trying to hold on to the impossible intimacy of the moment. My sensory awareness, always on high alert around him, went into overdrive. The world shrank until it contained only the space we occupied. I was acutely aware of the sound of his breathing, a steady, rhythmic presence that was somehow more grounding than the solid floor beneath my feet. In the dim emergency lighting, I could see the subtle rise and fall of his chest. He had settled onto the stool next to mine, close enough that our knees were almost touching. I could feel the warmth of him beside me, a silent promise against the cold. We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the symphony of the storm. The wind howled, and the rain beat a frantic, relentless rhythm on the windows. But in our small bubble, a strange calm had settled. The usual anxiety that hummed beneath my skin whenever he was near had been replaced by something else, something quieter and more profound. It was the terrifying peace of surrender. There was nothing I could do to control this situation. There was no routine to fall back on, no procedure to follow. I just had to be here, with him. My dad wanted me to be a doctor, Julian said suddenly, his voice quiet but clear over the rain. The confession hung in the air between us, unexpected and deeply personal. I turned to look at him, really look at him. His face was in profile, his gaze directed at the rain-streaked window. He's a surgeon, he continued, his voice losing some of its usual confident edge. A damn good one. He's saved hundreds of lives. He sees what I'm doing, genetics, research, as less, not as important. He thinks I'm wasting my potential in a lab instead of an operating room. This was the first crack in the marble facade. The perfect, unattainable Julian had a father he couldn't please. He had insecurities. He had a past that shaped him, a future that worried him. The sculpture in the museum had just bled, and in doing so, had become breathtakingly human. I think what you do is important, I said, the words coming out before I had a chance to second-guess them. My voice was hoarse. Understanding these things, it's the foundation. It's how you even get to the point of saving those lives. He turned his head to look at me then, and his eyes found mine in the dim light. There was a vulnerability in his expression I had never seen before, a rawness that made my chest ache. You really think so? He asked, and it wasn't a rhetorical question. He was genuinely asking. I know so, I said, and for the first time in our entire acquaintance, I felt completely certain of myself. You're brilliant, Julian. You see patterns nobody else does. You make this work come alive. The admission felt huge, a confession of all my months of silent observation. He didn't look away. His gaze was steady, intense, and it felt like he was seeing me, truly seeing me, for the very first time. Not just as his quiet, competent lab partner, but as someone else, someone more. The air between us grew thick, charged with unspoken things. The rain continued its relentless assault on the glass, but it felt distant now, like a soundtrack to this singular, pivotal moment. The space separating our knees had vanished. His leg was now resting gently against mine, a line of warmth and pressure that anchored me in the swirling chaos of my own emotions. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, beating out a rhythm that said, this is it, this is it, this is it. He didn't break eye contact. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, pulling us further into our own isolated world. The faint green light softened the lines of his face, making him look younger, more uncertain than I had ever seen him. The confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet question that lived in the space between his parted lips. Then he moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion, a closing of the final few inches that separated us. It gave me every opportunity to pull away, to break the spell, to retreat back behind my walls. But I was frozen, caught in the tractor beam of his gaze, my entire being screaming a silent, desperate yes. His hand came up, not to my face, but to the collar of the jacket he'd given me. His fingers were warm as they brushed against the fabric, his thumb gently stroking the space just below my jaw. It was a gesture of such profound tenderness that it made my eyes burn. "Leo," he whispered, and my name on his lips was a revelation. And then he leaned in and kissed me. It was not what I had imagined in my most secret, foolish fantasies. There was no fire, no desperate passion. It was soft, tentative, a gentle pressure of his lips against mine. It was a question. It tasted faintly of the coffee we'd shared hours ago, and of the rain, and of something that was uniquely him. His lips were softer than I could have ever imagined. My mind went completely blank. All the analysis, all the observation, all the carefully constructed theories I had about him evaporated in the face of this one undeniable piece of data. My own lips, clumsy and inexperienced, moved against his in response. I lifted a hand, intending to touch his face, his arm, anything, but it hovered uselessly in the air for a moment before I let it fall back into my lap. The kiss deepened slightly, a shift from a question to a statement. It was a confirmation of everything I had been too afraid to even hope for. When he pulled back, it was only by a few inches. His forehead rested against mine, and his hand was still on my collar, his thumb now stroking my skin. I could feel his breath on my lips, warm and steady. My world had been orderly. It had been safe. It had been a collection of known variables and predictable results. Now it was this: the roaring storm outside, the dim, green light, and the warmth of Julian's body next to mine. The carefully constructed walls of my life hadn't just been breached. They had been leveled, reduced to dust by a single, impossibly gentle kiss. And in the wreckage, for the first time, I felt something that wasn't lonely. It was terrifying. It was everything. The power returned with a sudden, violent hum just before dawn. The harsh, white fluorescent lights flickered on, banishing the shadows and chasing away the fragile intimacy of the night. The lab was once again a sterile, clinical space. The magic was gone, and in its place was a thick, suffocating awkwardness. We both flinched back from the sudden brightness as if caught doing something wrong. He pulled away from me completely, moving to the other side of the lab bench to gather his things. The warmth that had been a constant presence beside me all night was gone, and the cold of the room rushed in to fill the void. He wouldn't look at me. His movements were stiff, unnaturally focused on the simple task of packing his bag. The silence was a physical weight. Every tiny sound was magnified. The zip of his backpack, the clink of a beaker as I moved it into the sink, the squeak of our shoes on the linoleum floor. The air, which had been charged with a kinetic, electric energy just moments before, was now dead and heavy. I tried to think of something to say, anything to bridge the chasm that had opened between us, but my mind was a frantic, useless blank. I should go," he said, his voice clipped and formal. He still wasn't looking at me, his gaze fixed on some indeterminate point on the wall behind my head. "Okay," I whispered, the word barely audible. And then he was gone. The lab door swung shut behind him with a soft whoosh, and I was alone. The jacket he had given me was still draped over the back of my stool. I reached out and touched it. The fabric was cold now. The walk home through the post-storm dawn was a blur. The world was washed clean, the streets slick and reflective, the air smelling of wet asphalt and damp earth. But my mind was a maelstrom of doubt and self-recrimination. The anxiety that had been soothed by his presence during the storm came roaring back, 100 times stronger than before. My internal monologue began its vicious spiral. It had been a mistake. Of course, it had been a mistake. He was trapped. It was dark. We were both tired and stressed. It was a moment of temporary insanity, a fluke brought on by atmospheric pressure and emotional vulnerability. He was straight. He had to be. He was probably waking up this very second in a cold sweat of regret, horrified by what he had done, by what I had let him do. I had misread everything. His confession about his father, the way he looked at me. I had projected my own desperate longing onto a series of meaningless gestures. I had taken a moment of kindness and twisted it into something it was never meant to be. And now I had ruined it. I had ruined the one good, easy thing in my lonely life. Our comfortable partnership was shattered. He would probably request a new partner from Professor Albright. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting knife in my gut. How could I ever face him again? The next lab session was scheduled for 2 days later. It was the longest 48 hours of my life. I barely slept. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, analyzing it from every angle, searching for some clue I had missed. Each time, I came to the same conclusion. I was a fool. I had built a fantasy out of nothing, and now I was going to pay the price. When I walked into the lab, he was already there, meticulously calibrating a pH meter. He looked up when I entered, and his expression was completely neutral. There was no warmth, no recognition of the monumental event that had passed between us. Just a polite, distant nod. "Hey," he said, his voice flat. "Hi," I replied, my own voice a strangled whisper. The session was excruciating. We worked with a cold, robotic efficiency, our movements precise and disconnected. We spoke only when absolutely necessary, our words limited to the sterile vocabulary of our experiment. Past the saline, did you record the turbidity? Check the incubator temperature. The easy camaraderie we had developed over months was gone, replaced by this brittle, professional formality. He stood on his side of the bench, I stood on mine. The 3 feet of linoleum between us felt like a mile-wide canyon. He avoided my eyes. Every time I glanced up, he was looking down at his notes, at a petri dish, at the computer screen, anywhere but at me. I took his distance as a confirmation of my worst fears. He regretted it. He was embarrassed. He wanted to pretend it never happened. The emotional chasm I felt was no longer just perceived. It was a tangible, uncrossable reality. The silence was louder than the storm had been. We finished our work for the day early. The relief I should have felt was completely absent, replaced by a growing dread. As we began the familiar routine of cleaning up, my mind was already racing, planning my escape. I would just finish washing these beakers, pack my bag, and flee before he could say the words I was dreading. About the other night, it was a mistake. I was scrubbing a flask with frantic energy, my knuckles white, when his voice cut through the sound of the running water. "Leo." I froze, my back still to him. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The rejection. The end. "Can we talk after this?" I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself. I managed a small, jerky nod, unable to trust my voice. He said nothing else, and the silence returned, heavier and more foreboding than ever. We finished cleaning in that tense, suffocating quiet. I moved as if in a dream, my limbs feeling heavy and disconnected from my body. When it was done, I turned to face him, my stomach a tight, painful knot. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a croak. He led the way out of the building and across the main quad, which was bustling with students enjoying the post-storm sunshine. It felt surreal, this vibrant, normal world existing alongside my own private apocalypse. He didn't stop until we reached a secluded corner of the campus, a small, quiet patch of grass behind the old library, shaded by a massive oak tree. It was a place I had never been before. He turned to face me, and for the first time since that night, he looked me directly in the eye. The neutral mask was gone. His expression was a tumultuous sea of anxiety and something else I couldn't name. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I now recognized as a nervous tic. "Look," he started, his voice rough. "About the other night. I've been an idiot." My stomach plummeted. "Here it comes. I was an idiot to kiss you. It was a mistake." "I'm so sorry," he said, and the words were raw. "The way I've been acting, ignoring you. I freaked out." I stared at him, confused. This wasn't the script I had written in my head. "I didn't regret it," he said quickly, as if he could read my mind. "Leo, I absolutely did not regret it. I've never done that before. Kissed a guy. And it felt right. It felt more right than anything else has in a very long time. And that scared the hell out of me." The world tilted on its axis. He wasn't rejecting me. He was scared. Just like me. "I've known for a while, I guess," he continued, his gaze dropping to the ground as if the confession was too heavy to make while looking at me, "that I wasn't entirely straight. But I'd never told anyone. Never acted on it. I just kept pushing it down, trying to be the person my dad, everyone, expected me to be." He took a deep breath and looked up at me again, his eyes dark and earnest. "And then there was you. You're quiet and brilliant, and you see things other people don't. I noticed you from the first day. I kept hoping Albright would pair us up. And when he did," he trailed off, shaking his head with a small, self-deprecating laugh. I spent months trying to figure out how to talk to you about anything other than titrations. The revelation hit me like a physical force, knocking the air from my lungs. He had noticed me. He had wanted to be my partner. The entire foundation of my assumptions, that I was invisible, that he was unattainable, crumbled into dust. I stayed late that night on purpose, he admitted, his cheeks flushing slightly. I knew you'd be there, and I wanted to be alone with you, away from everyone else. I never expected the storm or the blackout. But when it happened, it felt like a sign or something stupid like that. And I thought, maybe this is my chance. He took a hesitant step closer to me. But then, in the morning, you were so quiet. And I convinced myself that you were the one who regretted it. That I'd crossed a line and completely freaked you out. I thought I'd ruined everything. So I pulled back. I thought that's what you wanted. The relief that washed over me was so profound it made me dizzy. It was a tidal wave, cleansing and absolute. All the anxiety, all the fear, all the self-doubt of the last 2 days was just gone, replaced by a breathtaking, terrifying hope. No, I said, and my voice was finally clear and steady. No, Julian. I didn't regret it. I thought you did. I thought it was a mistake. I thought you were straight. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds. No, he said softly. Not a mistake. And definitely not straight. And then it was my turn. The words I had kept locked away for so long came pouring out. I told him how I had watched him all semester, how I had memorized the sound of his voice and the scent of his soap. I told him I thought he was a masterpiece in a museum, something beautiful and completely out of my reach. I told him that kiss was the single most incredible and terrifying moment of my entire life. By the time I finished, there were tears stinging my eyes, and he had closed the remaining distance between us. His hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs gently wiping away the moisture from under my eyes. His touch was warm and sure, a solid anchor in the emotional storm. Leo, he murmured, his smile full of a tenderness that made my heart ache. You're not in the museum. You're right here. He leaned in and kissed me again. This kiss was nothing like the first. There was no tentativeness, no question. It was sure and deep and full of all the relief and unspoken longing of the past few days, the past few months. It was a kiss that said I see you and I choose you, and I'm not scared anymore. It was a confirmation, a promise. It felt like coming home. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, just as he had in the lab, but this time it wasn't followed by darkness and doubt. It was followed by the bright, warm afternoon sun filtering through the leaves of the oak tree. So, he said, his voice a low, happy rumble. Lab partners. I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt like it came from a place deep inside me that had been dormant for years. I think we can be more than that. He grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. We walked back across campus as the afternoon began to fade, the light turning golden and soft. For the first time, he reached down and took my hand. His fingers laced through mine, his palm warm and solid against my own. It felt impossibly natural, as if our hands had been designed to fit together. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental, a public declaration that shifted the very foundations of my world. I was no longer an observer of my own life. I was an active participant, walking hand in hand with the man I had only ever dreamed of from a distance. Our new dynamic was a delicate, beautiful thing. The next few weeks were a series of quiet firsts. The first time we studied at my apartment instead of the library, sitting close together on my small couch, the glow of our laptops illuminating our faces. The air was no longer charged with unspoken tension, but with a comfortable, easy intimacy. He'd lean his head on my shoulder while reading a dense passage, and the simple weight of him there felt more significant than any scientific breakthrough. We had our first real date at a small, unassuming Italian restaurant downtown. Over plates of pasta, we talked for hours. He told me about his childhood, about his complicated relationship with his father, and about his dream of one day running his own research lab focused on genetic diseases. I found myself opening up in a way I never had with anyone, telling him about my quiet upbringing, my love for the order and logic of science, and the loneliness that had been my constant companion for as long as I could remember. He listened with an intensity that made me feel like I was the only person in the world. The awkwardness that had defined us in the days after the storm was gone, but it became a touchstone for us, a part of our origin story. One evening, while we were watching a movie at his place, the lights flickered for a second, a brief power surge. We both froze, looking at each other in the dim light of the television screen. A slow grin spread across Julian's face. "You cold?" he asked, his voice laced with gentle teasing. "Need a jacket?" I threw a cushion at him, my face burning, but I was smiling. "Shut up," I said, but there was no heat in it. It was our joke, a shared piece of our history that belonged only to us. That night, born of a storm and a power failure, was no longer a source of anxiety, but the foundation upon which we were building this new, incredible thing. Our intimacy deepened in small, quiet moments. It was in the way he started making coffee for me in the morning before our early classes, remembering exactly how I liked it. It was in the way I found myself tidying his perpetually messy desk when he wasn't looking, arranging his scattered pens into a neat row. It was in the casual touches that were now a part of our language. A hand on the small of my back as we walked through a crowded hallway, his thumb stroking the back of my hand while we studied. The way he'd tuck a stray strand of my hair behind my ear. Each touch was a reaffirmation of the kiss in the dark, a constant reminder that this was real. One afternoon, late in the semester, we were finishing our final report in the lab. It was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was a comfortable silence, filled with the soft scratching of our pens and the knowledge of the other's presence. I looked up from my notes and just watched him for a moment. He was bent over his work, his brow furrowed in concentration, his hair falling over his forehead in that familiar way. The harsh fluorescent lights no longer seemed sterile and cold. They just seemed bright. He must have felt my gaze, because he looked up and met my eyes. He didn't say anything, just offered me a small, soft smile that reached all the way to his eyes. And in that simple, silent exchange, I understood everything. My life had once been a carefully controlled experiment. I had built my walls high, believing that safety and predictability were the most important variables. I had sought comfort in solitude, in the known quantities of my own small world. Julian was the anomaly, the unexpected result that had thrown all my data into question. He, and the storm we had weathered together, had introduced chaos into my orderly existence. But I had been wrong. The walls I had built weren't for protection, they were a cage. The solitude wasn't safety. It was just a different kind of emptiness. It took a power failure for me to see in the dark, and it took a terrifying leap of faith to realize that the greatest discoveries aren't made in controlled environments. They're made in the chaos, in the vulnerability, in the moments when you risk everything for a connection you can't measure or predict. He looked at me across that lab bench, the man I once thought was as unreachable as a star, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was the one variable I never wanted to live without.